The Supreme Court appears to be ready to totally upend essential federal protections for labor, healthcare, the environment, civil rights, and pretty much every area of American life. And this massive case, ironically enough, starts with a small fish, a herring used for bait and as canned sardines. Right, and the case comes from a pair of challenges brought by Atlantic herring fishermen against a Trump administration regulation imposed in 2020, with that directing commercial fishing vessels to pay observers they were required to carry on board for certain trips to collect data to prevent overfishing. And to impose that rule, the National Marine Fisheries Service drew from a 1976 fishery conservation law. But then a coalition of fishermen sued, arguing that the law does not explicitly authorize fishermen to pay for the $700 a day observers. Now, a notable thing here is that the monitoring program actually only lasted a year, because of a lack of funding, and these fishermen were actually reimbursed for all their costs. But two suits, dubbed Relentless Inc. v. U.S. Department of Commerce and Loper Bright Enterprises v. Raimondo, those still pressed on. And in May of last year, the Supreme Court agreed to take up these two cases. But not because it has anything to do with fish. In fact, it never was. This is actually about a decades-long conservative crusade with the goal of weakening federal regulations to increase profits while transferring power from federal agencies to conservative judges. I'll explain. Are the fishermen behind these cases? They aren't just asking for a narrow ruling on this regulation that basically doesn't even impact them anymore. No, they're asking the Supreme Court to overturn a 40-year-old precedent regarding the authority federal agencies are given to impose regulations. And in fact, the Supreme Court itself explicitly said it wouldn't be considering any of this fish garbage when it agreed to take the case back in May. Instead, it'll just focus on whether to scale back or entirely reverse the legal framework that federal judges have used for 4 decades to decide nearly 20,000 challenges. Because the precedent in question here was set in 1984 with the case Chevron v. Natural Resources Defense Council. And this case is insanely important, with it even being described as one of the most consequential Supreme Court decisions in the court's entire history. But I would also describe it as one of the most technical, legalese-filled cases in the court's whole ass history. So I'm going to try and keep this short and consumable. Now, first up, to understand Chevron, we need to quickly talk about the role federal agencies play in lawmaking. Or when Congress created federal agencies, it gave them the power to implement and enforce the federal laws that Congress itself writes and passes, which looks like this. Congress will pass a sweeping law achieving some major policy goal, like, for example, providing affordable healthcare through Obamacare. But Obamacare is a massive and incredibly complex program. So instead of having politicians with no actual healthcare expertise sorting out every single technical detail, Congress delegates that power to experts at relevant agencies. So it's actually the agencies that come up with the specifics for implementing Obamacare and then enforcing those policies, which they do by making regulations. And because the world changes and evolves with time, agencies are given the ability to update and impose new regulations as needed to effectively enforce laws, as long as the new regulations comply with the original legislation that Congress wrote. And so as a result, Congress will write these bills in a way that gives agencies the necessary space to do that. But that can also create statutes that are vague. So it's not at all uncommon to see an agency interpret an unclear law in a certain way and then have that interpretation challenged in federal court, which then brings us back full circle to Chevron. Right, that Chevron suit was actually the result of a challenge to how the EPA had interpreted part of the Clean Air Act that defined certain kinds of pollutants. But when the Supreme Court took that case up, they also considered a much bigger question. When Congress writes a provision that is vague or unclear, should courts accept the interpretation experts and agencies came up with or impose their own interpretation? And in a unanimous decision, the court ruled in favor of the EPA, setting the landmark precedent that interpretation of vague statutes should be left to the experts. And the court going on to outline 2 overarching reasons for this, with the thinking being that they'll always have better knowledge of these technical and complex issues over judges, and second, it's way more democratic. Right, while agencies aren't directly accountable to voters, agency leaders are appointed by presidents who are. Meanwhile, federal judges are unelected political appointees who usually serve for life. So if they make a bad decision on these cases, voters can't do shit. Now, very notably here, when this decision was first made, it had broad support from conservative judges. In fact, one of the earliest and strongest proponents of all this was Justice Antonin Scalia. I mean, one of the most conservative justices ever. And beyond that, Justice Clarence Thomas also supported the president in 2005, though he changed his mind 15 years later. And he also wasn't alone. In recent years, opinions on this have shifted as the fight for deregulation and limiting administrative power have become central tenets of the conservative legal movement. And those two things go hand in hand, with those who favor deregulation frequently arguing that federal bureaucracies are too bloated and have too much power. Though critics counter that conservatives care more about money than the regulations that are put into place to try to make things better. And of course, with this being so much about money, businesses, corporate special interests, and Republican megadonors have thrown billions of dollars at fighting regulations and limiting the scope of authority given to federal agencies. And the folks behind this effort include some of the biggest names in the game, like the Koch brothers, who just themselves have spent millions and millions of dollars creating a whole network of nonprofits to achieve conservative legal goals, including taking down Chevron. And so now that Trump's given the Supreme Court a conservative supermajority stacked with sympathetic appointees, they finally have the perfect opportunity. And that's exactly what's going on with Loper Bright and Relentless, where the fishermen in both of these cases are being represented by conservative groups that have received millions of dollars from the Koch network. And beyond that, the growing anti-regulation push has coincided with a conservative effort to concentrate power away from the federal government and towards the now conservative Supreme Court. And that's something that that we've even seen the conservatives on the Supreme Court doing themselves. Right around the time Biden took office, those justices began to embrace a vague theory called the major questions doctrine. And basically, that doctrine says that Congress needs to explicitly authorize agencies to make certain regulations that would have a major economic or political impact. Otherwise, the Supreme Court has the power to strike down the rule. Or in other words, the conservatives have basically given themselves the power to veto any policy they disagree with as long as they deem the impact major enough. And they've actually done exactly that with a handful of Biden administration policies, that including the eviction moratorium, the vaccine mandate, and of course, student loan forgiveness. But overturning Chevron would go way further towards that goal. It would represent an unprecedented power grab that not only gives undue authority to Supreme Court justices, but all 850 federal judges as well. And I cannot understate how possibly catastrophic all this could be. But at the very top level, unelected judges with no policy expertise would be given the final say on incredibly important and complex policy issues. Meanwhile, career experts who have made these decisions for the last 40 years could just be ignored altogether. And as a result, the judges could just strike down a regulation in favor of their own partisan policy agenda, and there'd be no accountability. I'm not talking about just future regulations. If the Supreme Court undoes Chevron, it is unclear what would actually happen to the hundreds of existing statutes and thousands of existing regulations that were affirmed by the doctrine. So all of those could be in jeopardy and absolute chaos could ensue. If any regulation can be challenged, it likely would, and we'd see a flood of litigation that would completely overwhelm the federal court system, including the Supreme Court. But also understand, it's not just the court systems that would be thrown into disarray. This would also have massive and potentially devastating consequences for the American people. Our government regulations are meant to help society, to help us. And well, undoubtedly, there are examples of just ridiculous red tape where there does not need to be. There is also a lot of good. And when those are just up in the air because of litigation or they're overturned altogether, we risk losing tons of essential protections. And this is the government will be much more limited in its ability to set new ones because courts could just strike those down too. I mean, there's no shortage of facets of American life this could touch. For example, millions of Americans could be prevented from accessing affordable health care because the Department of Health and Human Services regulates the administration of Medicare, Medicaid, and CHIP, which altogether provide insurance for 155 million people. But some of the key rules for that program, they were set under the Chevron precedent. And if those are litigated, the whole healthcare industry would get disrupted. Similarly, dozens of environmental regulations on air, water, and chemical pollution would be threatened, and the EPA's ability to impose new rules would be undercut at a time when we need to ramp up efforts to fight climate change. And this is the EPA also protects Americans' health by regulating a ton of industries like agriculture, transportation, construction, oil, and more. But if those rules were struck down and the EPA weakened, citizens would be at the mercy of big corporations. Hell, labor regulations covering basic protections for unionization and collective bargaining would also be in danger, as would labor standards that impact 150 million workers and ensure that employers are complying with rules on things like minimum wage, overtime, and employing minors. Key civil rights statutes would also be jeopardized, including regulations that prohibit housing discrimination based on race, sex, disability, and other identity-based factors. Also, safe housing rights for survivors of domestic violence. The main thing is, obviously, there's no shortage of what this could touch. And understand, this is not like a soft hypothetical. In mid-January, the justices heard oral arguments on Loper Bright and Relentless. And as you might expect, we saw the court's 3 liberal justices indicating support for keeping Chevron, but you had at least 4 of the conservative justices making it pretty damn clear that they're open to overturning or at least limiting the landmark decision, with only the 2 potential holdouts being Chief Justice John Roberts and Justice Amy Coney Barrett. And only one of those 2, going with the rest of the conservatives, would be necessary to overturn decades of precedent, something that directly and seriously impacts millions of Americans in day-to-day life. But for now, we'll have to wait to see what happens because a decision isn't expected until June. So without a doubt, we'll be talking about it again then, but in the meantime, I'd love to know your thoughts on this.